Today we're going to be making a straight cut jig for the circular saw. So we're going to need a drill as well as the circular saw. The result will be this nice straight cut jig. So we're starting out here with 12mm MDF. This has a very straight factory edge, but any piece of timber with a straight edge will do. Just put a couple of strips of timber underneath. This is just going to elevate it off the ground, so we can then make a nice cut. And to use as a guide, to help us get this initial cut, we're going to use a sheet of plywood. So we'll just line it up roughly. Then on our circular saw, we're just setting the depth of the cut. So on the Ryobi circular saw, you can see through the little window here the depth of your blade. So you just line it up and then twist the dial to lock it in. You've got to take into account the width of the base there when you're making the cut. So we just want to get a strip of 1 or 2 inches on the side. So we'll leave that sort of gap between the circular saw and the sheet of ply. Then we'll just clamp that ply into place. Just using it square, just to roughly square up this sheet of ply on top. But keeping in mind it's the factory edge of the MDF, which is going to be that straight edge in the jig at the end. So if this isn't 100% accurate, it's still okay. So you can see here, I've stuffed up. I haven't set the depth deep enough. So we're going to reset the depth and then we'll give it another go. So it's almost through. We'll give it about another 5 to 10 mil just to make sure we get the job done this time. So it's that factory edge on the left, which is going to make up the straight line on the jig. Just keeping in mind the width of the bottom of the circular saw. So when we're cutting the ply, which will make the base of our jig, we want to have that width plus enough on the edge to stick that MDF on top. So you can see it's wide enough now for the base of the circular saw, as well as for that strip of MDF on top. The extra will be cut off later. So it is a bit wobbly, so we do need to make sure we use the other factory edge of the MDF to make sure that's completely straight. As you can see, it's quite a long jig at about 2.4 meters. So we're just butting it up against the other factory edge of the MDF, just to make sure that there's no bend in that when we lock it down into place with the glue and screws. So we'll initially just glue it down, get it a bit tacky. And then we'll just put a few screws in as well. Making sure they're nice and flush with the top of the MDF. So we'll lift our MDF guide off the top, and then we're left with basically the finishing jig. You can see here is where I stuffed up again earlier, where I didn't allow enough width for the bottom of the circular saw. So measure once, measure twice, cut once. But once we finish it off, it's going to be removed anyway, so it's not so much of a problem. So we're just clamping it down, making sure we've got some space underneath, so we don't want to hit the floor here. I'm just going to run the saw over it. So that excess is now dropped away, and we're left with the circular saw straight jig. Now that plywood underneath has been, I guess you could say, aligned by the straight edge of the MDF that's sitting on top. So we've got a perfectly straight line of 2400 mil or 2.4 meters. So now what you need to do, if you want to if you want to cut, line up the jig with exactly where you want the saw to hit. So in this case, we're after 150 millimeters. Line the jig up to the edge wherever you've marked, clamp it down, clamp down the other end as well, set the depth and make sure the depth is also taking into account the depth of the plywood jig. So if you've got a 10mm piece of ply and a 10mm jig, you need to set your depth for at least 20mm. Now we'll have a quick look at the results. We're after 150mm, which is what we measured up at the start. And you'll find this one is bang on 150mm. This is the straight cut jig for the circular saw. It's going to be a favourite. Hope that you enjoy.